Sally.
God bless you. Have a seat for a second. So, I don't think you got it yet, because I just put it in the mail yesterday afternoon, but in the newsletter, I talk about the Feast of the Protection and the history of this feast. And I don't want to reiterate too much of that, but I have to reiterate a little to introduce what I do want to talk about. So this feast is deeply intertwined with a very specific church that you will hear about occasionally in the histories, and maybe when I read the lives of the saints, or you'll see maybe something mentioned about it on the church calendar. It's called the Church of the Flacernai, or the Flacernai. And it comes from the term the Vlachs. And if you know your ancient Eastern European history, you might know who the Vlachs are. The Vlachs were the early Romanians who lived in the lower Danube, the area now called as Dobruja. And to this day, the lower part of the Danube River region, not the delta, but the region around past it, is still called Wallachia after that. And there are still people who call themselves Vlachs to this day. So there were a group of these people. They were ethnically kind of a mix of Roman and Dacian and so forth that came to Constantinople and dwelt in a little suburb outside the main city walls. Later, that suburb would be surrounded by another set of walls and another set of walls, because that's how ancient cities work. And they set up this little colony. So their suburb was called Flacernai, the Vlachs lived. And there they had a little church, or there was actually just a spring, a very holy spring. It was considered to give holy water. Now, in the middle of the 5th century, about 450, there had just been the Council of Ephesus. You can read about this council in our newsletter this month as well. And at the council reaffirmed the term Theotokos when talking about the Virgin Mary. That the Virgin Mary did not give birth to a man who was later adopted to become the Son of God, or who later was fused with the divine Son of God, or some weird thing, but that the person who came in out of her womb, who she nursed, who she took care of, was fully God and fully man. So we call her the birth giver of God, because the person who came out was a divine person. So not long after that, there were the beginning of many feasts for the Mother of God really have their start after that council. They might have been celebrated locally in certain places, but they, with the kind of the council, the seal of approval from an ecumenical council, they become very much part of the life of the church. And so the empress at that time was Empress Saint Pulcheria. And she decided to dedicate a church to the Mother of God in the capital, and looked around and saw this little suburb of the Vlachs and their holy spring, and said, this is the perfect place. I'll build a church here dedicated to the Mother of God. Maybe they were already doing that thing. And what's interesting to me about this, I'm not just telling this for trivia purposes, but this, as far as I know, may be one of the first examples of a church called St. Mary's, essentially. It was one of the first churches specifically dedicated to the Mother of God. And it was about 450 AD. Now, there are probably other churches before then, but this was a really big deal because the empress did it. So this was became the national shrine of the Mother of God, if you will. Like we have the Immaculate Conception Shrine in DC, right? That's a big deal. So this was kind of the first time something like that really happened in the history of Christianity. And shortly thereafter, from Jerusalem were brought relics. We don't have relics of the body of the Theotokos, see the remission from last couple of months ago. But we do have the relics of her clothing that were left behind, like the books by Timothy left behind. Her clothes were left behind. Her veil, her robe, her belt, and these were the most precious relics that you could have, because you couldn't have any part of her body otherwise. And so these were brought then to this new kind of imperial church of the Mother of God, and became a wellspring, not just of water, which is still there, by the way. You can still go to it. The Turks call it a yasma, from Aki Yasma, for holy water. still a place you can visit. But these holy relics were there, people would come and pray before them, and there were miracles associated with them. There was a miracle about, and there was also an icon, one of the earliest icons of the Mother of God, called the Vlakarinitsa, was there. And it's a type of icon that we still see today in many churches. And there was a miracle that would take place where the veil that covered the icon would lift on Friday nights occasionally, and then come back down Saturday morning. And it was like this concept of the veil lifting and so forth that maybe helped to generate this expectation of what we would later see, the protecting veil. Many miracles took place in and around this church. Many important events in the history of the church took place in and around this church, St. Mary's Church in Constantinople. And in fact, St. Romanos, that we're also commemorating today, St. Romanos, was a singer and a musician, and is credited with singing many beautiful hymns and writing them for the church. But he was also inspired by God in doing this. At one of his visits to this Church of St. Mary's in Constantinople, he was there for the Feast of the Nativity. And this was, a fairly new feast in Constantinople, started around 400, so it had only been around for a while. They didn't have all the hymns that we have today, all the Christmas carols that we all have today. They were still making them. And while he was there, he saw a vision of the Mother of God. And the Mother of God came to him and gave him a scroll and said, "Eat this," very much like something of the prophets. And he took the scroll in the vision and he ate it, and immediately he had the words of the Kontakion of Christmas, which we still sing the first part of in the Christmas season. The Virgin gives birth today to the transcendent One, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable One. So forth. And that was actually just the beginning of a very long hymn with many stanzas, kind of the original mega Christmas carol. Started in this church, Church of St. Mary's in Constantinople. And so we commemorate that today, St. Romanos as well. So this church had all these wonderful events related to the Mother of God. In the 9th century, when there was an attack of pagans, and there was a couple different, there was in the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century, there were attacks on the city. Constantinople was the biggest city in the world, had a lot of money, even at that time. Fell on hard times later, as you may well know. But at that time, it was still a gem. It was the gem of civilization. People were always trying to attack it, raid it, Pirates of the Caribbean style, break in and steal what they could and get away. And most of the time, the walls were enough of a deterrent, but sometimes they were quite deterrent. And in those cases, people got very scared. And then they knew that in that moment, they had to rely on a power greater than their walls and their Greek fire and their technology and their money. They turned to the Mother of God. And over again, they would go to this church, St. Mary's Church in Constantinople. They would pray to the Mother of God, and she would deliver them through many miracles. And I read about that in a second. But the most significant one that forms the basis of this feast was this event in about 910, when a huge Russian fleet was coming down from like Odessa, right, from what we would call it Ukraine. And they were the Rus, and they were pagans. They had not yet converted. They would only convert about a century later under St. Latin, or 80 years later or so, 90 years later. And this was actually a pivotal moment, perhaps, towards that, because they came with all their forces and their might, and they thought, we'll make swift move of these Christians. We're basically Thor worshiping Vikings. It's kind of what the early Russians were. They were pretty tough guys. And they prayed to the Mother God, and they took her veil, which was in the church, and they brought it to the water, and they just dipped it in the water. And all of a sudden, what had been fairly still water was allowing the fleet to approach. The storm came up, waves came up, and sank the whole fleet, pretty much. So it's a pretty intense event. And in the church, that's actually 860. And then in the church, then in 910, another group of people are raiding, because there's all these attacks. And there's a man named Andrew. And I like to think, because the tradition says that he might have actually been a captured Slav, which means he might have been one of these sailors back in 860 who had attacked the city and now is living out his life like a captured slave, basically, who had become a fool for Christ. He was called a fool for Christ because we had this idea in, Byzantine, somebody who seemed kind of crazy to maybe were hiding real piety underneath them. If you saw that movie, The Island, Ostro, is about a fool for Christ. Very good depiction of what that's like. And if you read the book Loris, another very good depiction of what that's like. This fool for Christ, Andrew, was in the church because there was an attack coming and the people were praying. It said it was the 4th hour of the night. 4th hour of the night would basically be midnight. So when the service would be maybe nocturne. And the people were in the church praying again to the Mother of God, the armies were attacking, etc., etc. And Andrew had his kind of a friend of his, a younger man who would later become, I think, patriarch of Constantinople, named Epiphanius. And Andrew looked up and he saw the Mother of God coming in through the door of the church, walking, kind of hovering through the church with the saints and the angels with her, and then coming up to the place where her icon was, and that veil was kept, and so forth. And there she lifted up her veil, and it covered over not only the whole church and everyone in the church, but in a way kind of spread to cover the whole city. And Andrew, who was a fool for Christ, but he was not unwise, turned to Epiphanius and says, "Do you see what I see? Do you see the Mother of God and the angels?" And Epiphanius looked up and he saw it too. He said, "Yes, Father, I see it and I'm overwhelmed. I'm filled with awe," which is important because if it was just a vision that Andrew had by himself, they could have said, "You're a fool, you're a crazy guy. Nobody believes you," right? But now here was another person who could see it. And we read from the book of Exodus tonight, which is different than the readings I had in my book. So I'm glad we had that. Those readings are better for this feast. That Moses could not enter into the tabernacle because of the cloud that filled the temple. What Andrew and Epiphanius were seeing was that same cloud of glory. They were seeing now the cloud of glory, though, not just encompassing the Lord of glory, but his whole divine council, his mother, the queen, arrayed in gold and glory, and all the angels and all the saints with her. So they were beholding the fulfillment of those things that even Moses hoped to see and did see. So, brothers and sisters, we celebrate this fact that the Mother of God is present in her church, and especially in those churches dedicated in her name. Our parish has its own little similarities, which I like to think about, to this wonderful church of the Blackernay. It was founded by, in the suburb of the capital, by a small group of Romanians and others who came together and said, "We need a church here too." And the bishop said, "We'll dedicate it to the Mother of God. I don't have a church to the Holy Protection." They wanted to do it for St. Mary, but we didn't have a church in our diocese for the Holy Protection because it's not a huge feast for the Romanian church. It's big in Slavic lands, and it's not as big in the Greek churches, in the Byzantine churches, let's say. So Romanians are kind of in the middle of that. So we didn't have one in our country for this. And so we're the uniquely dedicated to the Feast of the Protection of Mother of God. And so this whole story of this church and its relationship to our Holy Mother is, I'm offering it today to you as a reflection of what this church is called to be for this nation. Not just, like what, like this week, Father? No, I'm thinking like a Byzantine now. I'm thinking for the next 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 centuries, what our church is called to be. We didn't come here to Falls Church, Virginia to build a McDonald's, okay? We didn't come here to set up a church that would, we'd sell off to Pentecostals in 20 years or something like that when we decided we're done with it. We came here to establish a community dedicated to the Mother of God that would be the protecting veil for the entire nation. That's actually our calling, brothers and sisters, which makes me the most inadequate person on earth because there's no way I'll ever live up to that. But my prayer is that over 10 centuries or more, even after this nation has changed hands and changed names, which it will over time, this church in some way will still be here or in the city or in the area, still fulfilling its calling, still fulfilling its purpose. And if it's going to do that, it requires, us as a community to continue to do our part to get it through year by year and day by day, but also to think that way, to think that far ahead, and to realize we're stepping into something that didn't start with St. Pulcheria, didn't even start with Moses, but actually was established from the foundation of the universe in the will of our Creator. So if we start to think our way around those things and maybe view what we're doing here in a bigger picture sense, maybe we'll start to experience the things that they experienced in the church of St. Mary's in Constantinople. So joyous feast to you, my brothers and my sisters.